Hello guys, welcome back to Not Just Mecha. It's Marco here, and today we speed paint the Death Guard Plague Marine skill team, focusing on how working with an artistic mindset can ironically make you the most efficient army painter ever. As often happens around here, the narrative for this video spawned by itself from the combination of the visual tropes of the artwork that inspired the project, and the technical steps needed to recreate a similar feel and vibe in a quick and efficient speed painting form. I'm in love with this illustration. I love its bleak, high-contrast light that bleaches out and at the same time harmonizes the clashing saturated colors, and with all the high-density textures of the different materials. This one on the bones in particular is fascinating to me, because of the unusual, sketchy, horizontal rendering of the roughness, that's now officially part of my mental library of effects. So, with the, air quotes, limitations of a speed painting workflow, and a single, extremely functional major change of the scheme, of which we'll talk about later, I tried to translate the artwork into a 3D form able to work well in the distance of the gaming table. And during the work, I realized something about painting that I already knew in a semi-conscious level, but that I never really rationalized or put into words. And that epiphany is that if you paint in the right way, details don't matter, and somehow they tend to paint themselves. Don't worry, the irony of this statement applied to probably the busiest GW sculpts ever, combined with a render rich in textural information, is not lost on me. But I believe this is precisely where the idea came from. So let me elaborate while guiding you along my process and general thinking throughout the steps. I start with a coat of reddish-brown. That's both my primer and the subtle underlying warm, dirty and rusty feel. I often use the color of the primer as the deepest shadows, but in this case I'm adding an extra step, just to add a feel of rust and decay in the deepest recesses and lowest angles. So now I'm starting the real chromatic and value climb. And there are a bunch of theoretical decisions and tricks packed in this procedurally super simple basic step. First, as you can see, the value of the brown and the turquoise green is basically the same. And that's by design, because they belong to the same level of depth of the low to extreme shadows. Sure, representing different things, but in the same topographical spots. Second, the value of this extreme shadow is on the light side of the spectrum, because I want to render a directional but extremely powerful bleached light, so I have to move the whole progression on lighter territories. And third, I'm spraying with a lower pressure to create dotted rough layers that will grab and retain a bunch of weathering, and that will save me a lot of time in the texturing steps with the brush. Don't overthink the pressure and go visual. These days I'm airbrushing at almost 3 bar, so my low pressure, around 2 bar, is way higher than most painters will ever use. So just go for the combination of distance, opening of trigger and needle, and of course relatively lower pressure, that makes the dotting appear in your own setup. Then I set the warmer local/structural green of the armor. That's the pivotal point of the cold to warm contrast and the general progression of colors. But before closing the flow of the main volumetric element of the scheme, I set the base and then first light for the secondary purple-pink elements. So the eventual overspray and small mistakes of this more localized application will be absorbed by the mid layers as extra chromatic richness, and later they will be even better minimized and integrated by the upcoming high and extreme lights. When working with an airbrush, these timing precautions are the key to obtain a clean, basically self-correcting render. So now I can move to the semi-opaque yellow that, representing the chromatic character of the sick, warm environmental light of the scheme, goes literally on everything. It doesn't matter what the local color is. The key technical aspect of this step is in the choice of an only slightly opaque paint that can fuse with more than totally cover all the previous work, still building up lighter and warmer values. Cleaning the airbrush mess with a bit of color on the base and the black rim has a magical effect in better visualizing the work done until this point. And before closing the structure of the light, I take another detour to establish the modulated general tones of a few bits. Except for the bolters that have a totally different, contrasting dark color, and more important, a solid, non-organic nature that needs a new dark and opaque base. On everything else, I simply use a single pass of contrast paints, that, if not already super gentle and transparent like this light blue, I heavily cut with water and a pinch of medium, to get the extra translucency that will maintain as much of the value sketch as possible. Now I can close this stage with a gentle pass of white, that, being the extreme expression of the environmental light, can and has to literally go over everything. Working with transparent to semi-transparent layers gives you a bunch of procedural freedom, because you are counting on their final optical mixing. That happens, with exceptions, more or less in the same way in every order of operations. So you can choose the most functional and effective layering for different situations and effects. In this case, the strong directional white bleached light has the priority, so applying it after the contrast staining and the quick volumetric definition of the secondary bits, and not before, just makes more sense. But the exact opposite is true for the true metallic elements, that I'm going to render with my homemade metallic contrast-like recipe, counting a lot on this existing complete value modulation, basically using it like a proper sketched underpainting. The neutral, fluid Vallejo metal color is the base, with the extra specific tones I want, and more importantly extra transparency, coming from the highly saturated inks. Translucency that's also enhanced even more by the airbrush medium, and a couple of drops of isopropyl alcohol that magically breaks the cohesion of the metallic pigments and the surface tension of the mix, that this way will flow into the smallest details with absolutely no effort. Same concept for the warm orangey bronze gold elements. Because of the nature of its pigments, metallic paint tends to be dense, and with a grabby high friction between brush and surfaces, that creates a bunch of inconsistencies in coverage and brushstrokes, that of course slow you down with the need of multiple fixing passes. But with this mix, I get a great homogeneous coverage with a single quick layer, and quite a bit of automatic modulation coming from that contrast-like behavior that again wraps around the value scale that's already there. Time for oil paints, that this time, even if in a variety of tones, do a very simple job. The complex chromatic tricks of this project have been all packed and delivered by the previous steps. So, as you can see from the colors on my palette, the main objective here is to reinstate, polish and enhance the exact same information, just wrapping it in a softer, more gentle and progressive flow, coming from the connected light washes. Because of the weathered, dirty nature of Nargol Plague Marines, you were probably expecting a high-density, heavy pass of oils, but I'm actually keeping them very diluted, fluid and even more transparent than usual, because again, I'm really happy with my tones, that I just need to blend better. Plus, this watery consistency will accumulate more pigments specifically inside the recesses, generating a very strong illustrational dark lining, and the sensation of localized, greasy accumulations. Even the order of application of the colors is the same, moving from the warm, dark, rusty undertone to the local green tones of the armors and the blue-black, cold feel of the weapons, and the collateral tones of the tiny, let's call them tertiary bits. It's rare, but this time the cleaning stage is probably more interesting than the application. To get more gentle, blended jumps, I clean in two stages. A first general one with just dry Q-tips that remove and blend the excess of paint at the same time. Also, Q-tips in this case are better than makeup sponges because they tend to maintain nice, thicker and more irregular borders. And the second, more precise one, this time using micro quantities of white spirit to bring out the original extreme high values, but of course only on the high parts exposed to the light to increase the contrast even more. Because I left more oil paint than usual on these models, I let them rest overnight. And in the morning, I go back to acrylics and the quick definition of the metallic bits. But since, because of the workflow, everything tends to be a bit more advanced and rendered than the simple metal, I feel the need to see these elements come out a bit more before the final push on the rest. When painting sharp metallic bits, I like to work on a dry palette, so the paint is not passively diluted by the wet palette, remaining solid and totally opaque. But from the chromatic point of view, my attitude towards metals remains the same, and I get the tones I need by mixing a basic mid to high value metallic with inks. The orange sensation of the bronze comes from the mix of magenta and the intrinsic yellow note of the gold paint. And the silver gets its blue-green shade from phthalo blue-green. This is the major but subtle change of the scheme I was talking about at the beginning. that blue is not in the illustration, but for isolated figures without the strong environmental context of the artwork, the scheme needs an extra main color in contrast and harmony with the rest of the palette. That naturally happens to be the blue of a triadic harmony. And only later I noticed that that's literally the same solution adopted here. And the work is closed by a proper general step, with on the palette a representative of all the main colors of the scheme. I like these models a lot, and I'm enjoying the painting even more, so this time I'm not working in a dry assembly line. But even indulging in this hedonistic personal fun, this is precisely where I realized that in this whole project, this stage included, I didn't focus my attention on the small details at all. Sure, I gave them colors, but I've been so focused on the general mood, shapes and volumes that I've never seen stuff like the small insects, the narglings or the extra equipment as separate, extra annoying entities to paint. That simple shift, or lack of perception, has made me work all the extra bits and details, just as smaller masses inside the bigger masses. Basically a minor direct consequence of the general picture, like painting a single muscle in the main structure of an arm. And if you think about it, that's exactly what they are, especially at this scale. The well-defined chromatic sketch and its quick rendering of the flow of light on every macro and micro volume developed also all the important information of the details at the same time. So, procedurally, now I just need to add a bit of abstract texturing brushwork to give the illusion of having done a bunch of work. And here is the final result. Honestly, mostly because I really like the Death Guard, and I was having a bunch of fun with the painterly, illustrational render of these large volumes. The project took me slightly more than an hour per model, so definitely more than my usual, but still landing in a comfortable, high-efficiency territory. As often happens, it's difficult to properly convey the timing of each step, because of the relative complexity and length of the different explanations. But everything until the higher definition of metallics and the wet palette stage was incredibly quick, and in practice that simple. So 90% of these 7-8 hours of work has been spent on the last couple of indulgent, fun stages, where I was able to just turn my brain off and let the brush dance free over the sketch and all the previous, more technical setup. If you like this video, give it a like and subscribe. Remember that you can ask me anything down below with a comment, you can follow my projects during the week using one of my socials, or watch me painting live on Twitch. Check the schedule of the streams on the Twitch homepage. And if you want to support my work, check my Patreon page and join the community, or maybe ask for a commission. See you next week, guys!